Hi there. So we are on our third installment of our series on society's myths, right? So I hope that you've been enjoying this thing so far and tracking along with us, and that our reflection questions have also helped you to perhaps dig a bit deeper into things like what are the kind of myths that you have been perhaps subconsciously buying into, right? Because as we have said before, society create their own myths, and these myths have to do with how you view yourself, how you view the other, how you view even what society's end goals are supposed to be about, right? So I mean, and these end goals will impact on how you prioritize your own personal goals and how you actually order your day-to-day activities as well. So I hope that this has given some food for thought. So some of us may feel that we have actually built our lives with the end goal of economics, right? Or perhaps with the end goal of trying to find that special purpose that we're supposed to live for. I mean, whatever it is, right? There's actually no absolute rigid right or wrong. There's only a continuum. And on this continuum, you will find yourself often sometimes going back and forth between different end goals and even navigating the end goals that you become aware that you have been trying to pursue. And I think that's good because that wrestle and that struggle is what makes us human, right? So I mean, in the goddess episode, we talked about how there's morality oftentimes defined for us in very rigid categories, right? But going back and forth and understanding why we view certain things as moral and others as immoral does help us to reevaluate, not perfectly, but because then again, what is perfection, right? Yeah, but to reevaluate what we mean by shame and guilt and all these emotions that we struggle as a human being. So today we are going to dive into this topic, which is coming on the screen. Yes. Sustained by rituals. So when you hear the word rituals, what comes to your mind, right? Do you think of grisly, dark, full of blood and gore, blood sacrifice of certain animals and that rituals? Or maybe you think of rituals as in closer to home, right? The burning of incense and going to the temple, twice a month and offering your prayers. And that's your idea of ritual. Or maybe your ritual for those a bit more progressive and woke ones are things like you light a candle right at home and you want a nice fragrant environment, or perhaps your ritual is to wake up to lucking lucking coffee. Maybe that's your ritual. But whatever your rituals are they just simply repetitive action? What do you think? Are they simply just actions that we you know enact again and again in order to fill up the empty slots in our schedule? For example, like when I'm now recording this from not in Singapore, right? So I often take short vacations away from Singapore during the weekends. So is this my ritual, like when I take those vacations, and even what I do on those vacations seems sometimes to mirror and pattern, right? The previous vacation. So is this something repetitive and perhaps even meaningless, right? Or does it contain some kind of patterns that would reveal a little bit about perhaps what I've been conditioned to value, prioritize, believe, right? So I would say that once again, right, all these questions are truly open-ended because even, I mean, whether you say it is meaningless or whether you say that it is meaningful, it depends on your framing and it depends on how you're approaching it. So oftentimes, you know, rituals can exist to fill up some vacant space, right? Perhaps you're going through quite a difficult part of your relational life and someone has left or you're grieving the loss of something, right? And rituals help you to perhaps reorient yourself to reality where you actually take time to perhaps just sit alone and process your emotions through meditation. That's a ritual, right? And it's helping you, although innately by itself, disconnected from your context, it is meaningless, but it is helping you at this stage to fill up that gap. Or perhaps going down to the cafe to have a coffee before you start your day and just to read something instead of wallowing in perhaps self-pity for the same half an hour. That could be a ritual that is helpful, right? Not so much because you're doing so much in that, or you're doing something so significant in that half an hour, but you are actually taking steps to perhaps establish a rhythm to your life. So I guess there's that aspect to it, right? So, but there's also that aspect that rituals are not always just instinctive things we do, right? But actually, rituals can be planned. Correct. So there is an origin to it. So I mean, what I mentioned earlier about someone who perhaps is going through relational loss, and he or she is using this repeated actions to kind of like reorient himself, right, or herself to reality and to get back on his or her own 2 feet. Um, Perhaps it's something that becomes instinctual because he or she keeps doing it. But perhaps there is probably an origin to that ritual, right? Probably it's planned. And even if it's instinctual, it requires planning. Because as Adagio says, right, if you don't plan, you plan to fail. So I think there's truth to that because if you are just allowing moments and seconds and minutes and hours to pass you by, um, probably that's what is meant by an unplanned life, or perhaps what the philosophers would say, an unexamined life. Because if I don't examine my life, I can't reflect on what are the routines that work for me and what don't, right? So there's some sort of planning that goes involved in rituals. Even if you don't have those plans consciously in your head, you probably made those plans instinctively. Perhaps those plans were made for you by your parents or your friends or just the social context you're in, and you kind of like took them on your own, you know. So there is some sort of planning going on. So even with the other J that says if you do not plan, you plan to fail, you probably have a plan, just that you were not conscious of it. And because of that, that plan became solely instinctual, right? Detached from that executive functioning, right? So I've been reading recently on this book about how we should um think or rethink the people who are on the spectrum, how you should consider the different um states of autism, right? And how it may affect people's conditioning and their functioning in society and communities. And one of the things that was brought up by the author was that autism does affect what we call executive functioning. And I spoke to a teacher recently, one of my colleagues, and that was the same content of our conversation, right? We realized that executive functioning, the ability to coordinate multiple things at one time, right? The ability to simultaneously do one activity and still be considering what you should be doing the next, and the value judgment of the next activity vis-a-vis the one that you are doing now and vis-a-vis other options available to the person, right, in a given day. So even if you do not plan, you are actually planning, but perhaps your executive functioning isn't that strong, right? So that may cause us to then be stuck into rhythms and rituals that after a while we can't really grasp why we are doing them. So I think therefore it's a purpose question, right? So oftentimes people feel purposeless, but deep down it could be linked to to the very practical outworking of the rituals you do day to day, right? But my first question for you is, for all of us, is have we ever tried to disrupt our rituals or our routines, right? Have you ever tried to like not wake up with the wake up to the Luckin coffee and instead change to tea? Have you ever woken up not to do that yoga exercise that you have been doing so consistently and maybe just meditate, right? Or have you ever woken up not to meditate but to go to swim, right? And perhaps find that meditation is perhaps it's not just one a rigid definition, which is someone that probably is for example, if you're looking at the picture earlier, right? That person on the mountain, right? It can be expressed in some other activities or form, right? But have you ever disrupted it? And if you've disrupted your ritual, how do you feel about it? How did that disruption affect the rest of your day, right? Or did it affect the rest of your day? Or it was just an insignificant, you know, minutia deal, right? But I would venture to say it does because rituals do shape our everyday progression of activities, right? So, for instance, someone may come up with this expression. Have you gotten has he or she did he or she get up on the wrong side of the bed? They'll probably make the expression, right? Or yeah, or have you not had your coffee? Why do we ask such questions? We ask those questions because we find some intuitive connection between the activity the person does and the rest of his day, his emotions, his framing, his mental thought patterns, and his interactions with others and as well as with himself, right? So, this is how important rituals are. They actually do give us a sense of congruency, alignment with ourselves, right? And that's the most important, actually, agent in this world, yourself, right? In order for you to take action for growth and healing, you need to start with that first central principle of the self. Is yourself integrated, whole, or is yourself perhaps, when you do try to sometimes modulate your ritual, it may disrupt the sense of self, right? But then again, is that a good thing? Or is it not a good thing? Right? So, that's food for thought, right? And once again, I would say you have to answer that in every context that you're in, right? Whether that change in that ritual is something for the better or for the worse, right? But what has this got to do with myth, right? What has this got to do with societal narratives and values and certain stories? Because we say myths are ways that we explain who we are, how have we arrived at this point in time in history, uh, about our nation, right? What are in some sense, the selling points of our nation? Or yeah, what's the strength of our nation, right? And what's the direction, the meta direction that it's headed to? Because I know individuals have their own paths, right? But there is a kind of principle that is kind of like governing this path. It's a little bit like the show I watched yesterday, was Tron, right? So I think in all these science fiction shows, they're trying to show a tension between the individual and the system. So even the programs within a system may at times malfunction, right? So, and one of the malfunction that was introduced is this common concept of empathy, sympathy, emotions. When emotions enter, it is subjective. So the subjectivity ruins the objective, the large systemic principle that is governing all these programs within the system, and therefore the owner of the system, which is the human being, of course, is trying to stand out this resistance and this rebellion because he wants to control everything, right? Yeah, so in some ways, as the show, which is a kind of analogy of life, shows that we are all kind of like mini programs, human programs in a system, right? I know this sounds, I'm talking about it in a quite an upbeat manner, but honestly, it's very heavy and it's quite disturbing, right? That we are actually sometimes we live our lives as programs within a larger system, where the system controls the options we have. So we think we have options, but the system controls, right, the options available to us, right? Because if we go on a path that is the system doesn't track, right? In some sense, it is dangerous to the ultimate goals, end goals. Again, we talk about end goals of the system, right? And so I mean, and because of that, do you not think that this system would then impose rituals for the individual programs to follow, right? Which means do this, do that, do this, do that, right? And it has to become instinctive. So once again, there is a planner, which is the owner of the system plans definitely. And once again, the command, the even the main one of the main characters in the show was this person who was a program, but he is the lead program. He's the command security command or something like that, right? So he's the main security person. I mean, program, not person. In program slash digital person in this system, right? And he had to be shut down because he kind of malfunctioned. He malfunctioned because he stood out of his protocols, which is his routines, right? The routines of um, taking an order, following an order. And that doesn't mean he doesn't have any personal agency. He has, right? But his personal agency up to then had always been to plan to do those things that the system has planned for him, right? You get it? So you plan, but you plan to do the things the system has already planned for you. So they are all there for the money. You need to belong to the club. Right? Was a saying by one of the characters in Titanic, right? So this was I'm not sure, I think it's the aunt of Rose. That was trying to get Jack inducted into their club, right? And their club, of course, is a money grubbing, um, higher upper middle class in society, right? Higher middle class group in society. So those people that belong there, they will be talking about money all the time, right? How much they earn, how much they invest, their foresight, how they have made it in life, So it's very different from Jack's social group, right? So sorry for this. There's a lot of method analogies and I guess metaphors for life that I'm drawing out of Titanic because I've watched it um, in parts and in whole, perhaps twice in the recent 1.5 months. Because I feel that it's so moving, the romance, the legend. I mean, it's almost like a legend, the history of it, how the accident happened and all that. But the idea here is he had to learn or be introduced to another social class that was there just, I mean, and their central topic was money, right? Whereas his central topic was how do you survive? How do you cope? How do you still have fun in the midst of a very depressing life where you had little, that kind of thing, living from hand to mouth. But the other social club was about boasting in their monetary achievements, right? So the aunt was telling him, just say that you have some wealth, it will get you ahead, right? So, but then again, he didn't do it, right? He spoke to them about how we are all God's children, and I'm sure God cares, for all of us, and therefore I do not worry about, where I lay my head, right? Which is something similar to what Jesus said, right? Although Jesus said not in this carefree tone, but he's what um a keen awareness that if you come against and resist systems, they probably are going to spit you out, and you wouldn't have a pillow under your head, as we saw last time when we talked about the rebel, right? Yeah. So in some sense, our friends and our social circle shape our ritual because they are all talking about money most of the time. And I guess, and that's just a microcosm of their lives, right? Their lives would probably be ordered by that. And that was why Rose shared in the end that she had heard that her ex-fiance killed himself in the financial crisis that occurred in the 19, I think 19, is it 1930s? Yeah, probably in 1930s and killed himself, right? So why? Because there is that sense that his life had a myth, was orientated around a myth, which was that economics was everything. That because he was rich, he was powerful, more powerful than Jack, more powerful than those on the bottom deck of the cruise ship, right? Literally, those that were chucking coals into the engine, those that were keeping the lights on to the final moment. And yet it's ironic because they were those who were keeping the rest alive, right? And because their sacrifices, many of the people on the upper decks could actually get into boats first. But that we'll come back to that later, right? About equality and all, right? But for now, maybe just, I mean, I think the question for us to reflect on is who shares similar rituals as us, right? Who, so if you are always pulling out your yoga mat and or meditating or going on holidays, to and the slogan is to detox. I've been using it to detox, right? So who does? Do the people around you do that? So you might notice that yes, the people around you actually, if you notice, there is a common pattern, of how we should spend our money, our idle time, and all this becomes rituals. Meaning that we don't think twice about detoxing by going on holiday. We don't think twice about um, trekking to a mountain to meditate, right? Or we don't think twice about perhaps how we view work-life balance or work-life integration, or what does it even mean by that? Does it mean I cut down on the effort I put in? Does it mean I reorientate the effort I put into, to resist perhaps what I feel like is the kind of driving force of the majority? But all these things are shaped by the people around us, right? In some sense, they influence us and they support us. They become our ecosystem to concretize these rituals. These rituals, I mean, in order for these rituals to become concretized or solid or strengthened or established, they have to be supported by a social group. And that's why it's so hard for us to sometimes get out of certain addictions or certain patterns that are a bit toxic, right? That is beginning to become unhealthy because we over rely perhaps on a variety of things like money, shopping, I don't know, or even an over inflated concept of rest or balance, or maybe an addiction to even to social networking, perhaps social media, social networking, or maybe to sex, right? So I mean, there's a whole variety of things we are addicted to, and sometimes it's so hard to actually break out of them if we do not have an ecosystem of support. And that's because ecosystem supports rituals. And rituals, when practiced over the long haul, create life, right? It becomes our life. Our life are a set of habits, rituals that are shaped by the myth. So what's the pattern? I think that's the question. So again, there's no right or wrong, right? Obviously, we are shaped. I mean, this is just fact, human fact. We are social creatures, but what's the pattern? Are these rituals driving us to become more um, humane, compassionate towards ourselves, towards others? Are they driving us to become more um, diligent, serious about what actually matters? When we give a promise or when we sign a contract to offer up this amount of hours and to do this amount of tasks, we actually get it done and we put in the sacrifice needed. Is it driving us towards that? Is it driving us towards becoming people who are fair managers, who are, because managers have their social circles, and the time managers have their own rituals, how their rituals shape how they treat employees as well as customers and all that, right? So clients, what's the pattern? So pause and ask yourself, right? Do you know that? Do you know the patterns? Do you know how is it shaping you? And how do you feel about it? Right? What's your inner voice telling you about all these things. So along the lines of what is your inner voice telling you about all these things, I think just to bring this plane to a landing, literally to a landing, right? Because Titanic came to a fatal landing, to a fatal end. First class passengers first. So this was sheltered, right? By the crew as they gathered the women and children and separating them from the men, but all of them belonged to the first class, while the third class passengers were actually trapped in literally by gates, right? So, and they were unable to get out until almost the end. I mean, in the show, almost to the end, right? Because they got someone to open up with the key, right? And before that, they tried to do a revolt against the sailors. Yeah. How do you feel about this? I mean, what's your visceral reaction? So I'm presuming most of us will be like, this is so unfair, right? Or maybe you are a bit jaded and and it's okay to be jaded because I am jaded, you know, sometimes as well. And I think once again, right, when we talk about this deep soul search and deep soul searching things or life meaning exploration stuff, I think we should really detach this conversation from a very rigid morality, which means even as we talk about these things, sometimes we may find in ourselves these things like jadedness, cynicism, and it's important not to ask ourselves or to over critique ourselves as if to be cynical is immoral, as if to be hopeless is immoral, right? Because even in the ancient Christian tradition, hopelessness, despair, cynicism, jadedness are all part of the wisdom tradition. They're all part of how the ancient writers view spirituality, right? So once again, how do you feel about this? So you may feel jaded, cynical. You may feel that that's how the world is. That's why it's all about evolution, right? And it's all about the survival of the fittest. So the people at the top has already a chance to survive far greater in probability than the ones at the bottom, just because they are already rich, right? So it's back to that, whole social environment and group that you can't control, right? Yeah. But what's your rational response on hindsight, right? So when you look back, so maybe for those who you feel perturbed, you feel angry, you feel that this is not right. Perhaps when you look back, you're like, but the sailors are just doing their job, right? To prevent chaos. Because if for instance, if the workers at the bottom deck had allowed the lights to go off, wouldn't all of them die? Right, that's number one. And wouldn't chaos ensue even more? More people might die. Number three, if the third class passengers were to rush in, was the ship actually built large enough, on the above deck, on the top deck, to allow all of them into the lifeboats, or would actually chaos ensue once more, right? So I mean, if you look at all these things, and even the sailor that was rushing up, was he just rushing up for himself? Maybe he was rushing up to perform a duty. He had to make sure the lifeboats were um, successfully carrying passengers and successfully going down to the sea. I mean, onto the sea, right? So, and history has shown that, in fact, the sailors actually did a remarkable job. The sailors on Titanic, including the architect and including the captain, they all did their part, right? When Titanic was about to sink, to ensure that most lives would be saved. So, on hindsight, sometimes it does seem that this hierarchy is orderly. It does create some kind of cohesion to alignment, you would say, to ensure that chaos is kept to the minimum, right? Because obviously, I mean, we are thrown into a world. No, just reading a book, right? I recommend it to you, and just let me check because I'm not very good at memorizing titles. But I am good at memorizing and remembering the details within a text, right? And then it stays there a long time. But the title sometimes I don't really remember. So the book is called Fluke, right? So maybe you can take a look at this book called Fluke, Fluke. by the author Brian Klaas, 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 yeah, Brian Klaas, Klaas, right? Yeah. So the book Float actually highlights highlights many things. I mean, about reality and our psychology towards about reality and how we should, I mean, how we could navigate towards a more realistic assessment, right, of reality. So I think one lie that he says we are trying to hold on to is that the world is orderly, right? That the world innately is orderly, but actually we're saying that the world innately is not, right? So he was saying through rituals, we sometimes try to envision that with all these orderly systems and steps and protocols, we can control the chaos, right? But hear him properly. He's not saying that these rituals and orderly steps are wrong, are bad or unhealthy or out of sync with how we should view reality. But what he's trying to say is that sometimes we get confused that these steps that we have ordered, neatly into neat categories where we think about cause and effect, right? And it's a very rigid this causes that. We assume that that is at the heart of reality, that as if reality is so orderly and nicely packaged, right? But he was saying that actually everything affects everything, and therefore reality is traumatic, right? It really is because we want to hold on, and we've talked about this in our previous podcast. We want to hold on that reality is neatly or even religiously constructed, right? So there's an end goal, there are clear steps, but actually reality is ultimately confusing. So even if you remove the orderly first class and the first class passenger tier and third class passenger and allow everyone to just run for their life, would that be a better situation? Right? So it might not be too. So what do we do with that? What do we do with a world that we've been thrown in, that we have evolved from our previous ancestors, that in a very jungle, a wild environment, into an environment that we have constructed. We have progressed our consciousness to treat one another and to see one another flourish in the interdependent, collaborative, cooperative way. And I hope you're in the part of society that is experiencing more of that. Although I would say that in my part of the world, there is still so much more, right, in terms of consciousness of what it means to see your own image or even the image of the divine in the other, right? But so I think just to land the plane, my last thought is death the great leveler? Is it only at death can we settle this inequality once for all, right? Which means like the first class passenger and the third class passenger finally stands in the same level ground only at the foot of the grave, or when we are buried 6 feet under. Is this the only great leveler? Is it during, here and now, there isn't much we can do to, or perhaps we cannot change the fact that some people born in certain situations, or we ourselves born into certain situations, will permanently be facing certain kinds of probabilities and loss. Is this true? Maybe there's some truth in that. Some things are quite solid and fixed, right? So what does ancient wisdom tell us, right? So since I came from the Jesus tradition, I want to bring in some ancient wisdom, perhaps even from Jesus's death, right? There's this famous saying in the book of Hebrews. The writer is unknown. Something is Paul, but it could be others, right? He was writing that Jesus' death actually ended a certain order of things, right? So, I mean, the exact verse was, "It is appointed once for man to die." So again, it's appointed once for man to face death, to face the great leveler. In some sense, we can call it that, right? So to face death, and death is the judgment, because at death, in some sense, it judges, and in Hebrews, it talks about us being exposed for what we have done in our lifetime. So only at death, kind of like the first class passenger, is judged and um, and assessed for whether he actually has done um, good, right? In terms of his most innermost core, where the scripture in Hebrews says that both good and bad will be brought out from the secret places, right? So is it only death, right? So Hebrews is saying that yes, that in some sense, the writer of Hebrews is saying there is a sense that death is the great leveler. That's one. But then he follows up with this thing about Jesus, right? But Jesus died once for all so that man need not face judgment. So what does that mean? What does that mean? So in the originally, death is a great leveler that only at death will we be assessed whether we have lived well and our works will be exposed, right? Because at the point of death, no one is going to be able to have one-upmanship, right? Because we are all just flesh, blood, and bones, right? And yeah, human. But then it says that Jesus died once for all to bring us to God, and that we do not need to face judgment. So, in some sense, Jesus was ushering something new, right? And an order that was new. I mean, in the ancient wisdom, they call it the new covenant, something new into reality. Whereas in the first death, before Jesus's death, before this new order, there seems to be a sense that we are all. There is very little hope in terms of equality, perhaps fairness, justice, or even that for us to live into this consciousness of fairness, justice, and equality for all. It's very hard for us to live into it because it seems like these patterns of injustice, violence, cruelty, survival of the fittest is ingrained, it's in our nature, right? It is kind of like a survival thing that is both planned but is instinctual because it seems like the systems, society, environments perpetuate this, and the past societies perpetuate this in the present societies, and it's just a continuing runway, right? But it seems like there is a disruption. So we talked about disruption just now, right? So we said how would you feel if your rituals are disrupted? But there's in some sense a disruption of ritual here. That's why in the book of Hebrews it says that after Jesus' death, there is no more need for the priest to bring the sacrifices to the temple because there is once for all sacrifice, right? And this sacrifice has somehow ended the need for other sacrifices of from humans to atone, right, for their wrongdoing, which means in some sense we do not need now to wait. Could it be that we do not need now to wait till death to assess and re-evaluate how we have lived, and that in some sense we do not need to live our life with a view towards death, in the sense that only at death will the good be rewarded, the evil be, evil be dealt with, or retribution will come, only at death, and therefore all our life is lived now in some sense offering sacrifices to kind of like atone and prepare for that final day when we will then all somehow find out whether we can actually be part of a world where equality and justice rule. That we are now just like, it's just we keep on preparing for that day by I mean, the olden times, it was sacrificing animals and all that. But now perhaps like, I mean, the modern equivalent could be where we are actually um, postponing our joy, postponing our delight. We cannot live fully in the present because there's always this sense that perhaps in this life there is no hope in this life, right? I mean, in that sense, like there is no hope because evolution has so wired us to join the race, for the survival of the fittest. So in this life, it's always about trying to kind of prepare ourselves for the next life where we can then escape it. So we are kind of like always not being able to be fully alive and fully delighting in every moment of life because we are trying to extricate ourselves. There's always this sense of, okay, I'm trying to extricate myself from this rat race or from this me versus you because and you will always be here and it's despairing and I just can't extricate myself. I can't get out, but I just have to look towards that day, the death. I mean, death, the great leveler. But in some sense, Jesus is, I mean, the book of Hebrews ends with those who follow Jesus are like people who look towards a city that's not built by human hands. And they are on this exploration for a city that's not built by human hands. And they are people who extend hospitality towards others. I mean, in the Hebrews 13, 12 to 13, he talks about that. They are people who somehow have a certain end goal, the joy that was set before him, right? Which is Jesus's joy, which is for us to have this sense of reconciliation and equality and justice. Even in this life, I mean, he died for that, right? He died because he was trying to bring that kind of world into this world, and therefore he was put to death because uh, systems, as I said, feel threatened by such things, right? So in that sense, those who follow him have already begun that journey out of this world. We have already begun this journey out of this world, trying to find a city that's not built by human hands, for which this world they have no abiding city. So yes, there's a sense that we are kind of exiled, isolated, or perhaps not very aligned with the end goals of um, you know the current system of violence and competition and all that and power. But the thing is, we have already been extricated rather than we are actually trying to extricate ourselves. Right. So I leave you with that thought. What do you think? What do you think this means for you? Right? Can you taste a little bit of perhaps the freedom that this ancient wisdom contains?